Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah Stenson reporting to you by myself as Lars continues to recover and the team has time to prepare Chris to move into the broadcast style of the 1990s. Most Christians know that the Bible we read in English is a translation of the original Greek text. Nevertheless, on occasion, the Greek word is retained in our English Bibles to set apart the meaning of the text. One of those such instances is with the word Paraclete. That is one of the words used to name the Holy Spirit. And while it's a fairly familiar word to many of us, it only appears in the entire New Testament 5 times, and then only in the Gospel of John and in 1 John. In this episode, we're going to talk about the Paraclete, and we'll talk specifically about how the Paraclete works to help us in prayer. In order to get a foothold in this conversation, we're going to look at a few of the scriptural passages in which we find the word Paraclete. For starters, we'll look at the John 14:16 and 17. And I, Jesus, will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper, Paraclete, to be with you forever, even the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it neither sees him nor knows him. You know him, for he dwells with you and will be in you. And this is John 14:25 and 26. These things I have spoken to you while I am still with you. But the Helper, Paraclete, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I have said to you. In both of those passages, Jesus uses the word Paraclete to identify the Holy Spirit. So now let's dig into that Greek word, Paraclete, to get a better idea of what the word means. Of course, we see even in those 2 examples, the word Paraclete is translated as helper. And while this is accurate, it does not elucidate the full meaning of the word. The Greek word itself is really a compound word from the Greek para, meaning close beside, and kaleo, make a call. So properly, the Greek word Paraclete is a legal advocate who makes the right judgment call because he or she is so close. In this regard, then, Paraclete means an advocate, intercessor, a consoler, comforter, helper. Simply put, the Paraclete is more than a helper. Now let's put that in the context of the Holy Spirit and what Jesus is saying when he tells the disciples the Paraclete will be with them forever, telling them, reminding them of all that Jesus has said to them. Put simply, Jesus is telling the disciples, and now us, that the Holy Spirit will never be separated from Jesus. In fact, Jesus goes further and says the Holy Spirit will only speak what Jesus has said. And what is that? You are a sinner, and Jesus forgives you all that sin. Now there's one more passage I want to address to help put a little more meat on the bones of our understanding of the word Paraclete, and that's 1 John 2, verse 1. My little children, I am writing these things to you so that you may not sin. But if anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. In this case, Parakleton, advocate, is identified as Jesus Christ himself. And in this instance, the translation of Parakleton as advocate is quite helpful. Luther wrote on this verse, and he put it this way: whatever righteousness I have, this my Comforter has, he who cries out for me to the Father. Spare him, and he has been spared. Forgive him, help him. This text should be written with golden letters and should be painted in the heart. Therefore, you should say, Christ, I know you alone as the advocate, the comforter, and the mediator, and I do not doubt that you are such a person for me, but cling firmly to this with my heart and believe. You can see from this text and from Luther's comments on this 1 John text that the word Paraclete, while overtly identified as the Holy Spirit by Jesus, is in this text also identified with Jesus himself, and rightfully so, of course, because as was mentioned briefly already, you cannot separate the work of the Holy Spirit from that of Jesus Christ. You can think about it this way. After the resurrection and ascension of Christ, the Holy Spirit now steps in and functions as our comforter, our advocate, delivering faith in Jesus and his word of forgiveness. But before our exercise in the Greek language is complete, there's one more facet of the word paraclete we need to address, and that is the work of the Holy Spirit as our advocate, our intercessor, through prayer. For this, we'll look to Romans 8, verses 22 and 23, and then 26 and 27. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. For we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. And he who searches hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. The Apostle Paul is talking about people who have received the first fruits of the Spirit. In other words, Christians. People who have been baptized, who have heard the word of Christ, and yet find themselves groaning, suffering, as they and we wait for Christ's promised return. And while we wait, while we suffer, the Holy Spirit intercedes for us when we do not know what to pray for, and he intercedes with groans too deep for words. That is, of course, not to be taken lightly. What Paul is saying here is that the Paraclete, the Holy Spirit, is not simply a comforter, someone there to make you feel better, but rather that the Spirit is the Parakletos, back to the compound word I broke down earlier. Remember, para means next to or close to. Kletos means make a call. Thus, a legal advocate who makes the right judgment call because he is close enough to do so. Put that understanding in the context of this passage of Romans, and you start to understand what it is the Holy Spirit is doing when he is interceding in our prayers with groans too deep for words according to the will of God. The Spirit is so close to us that he knows the depth of our sin, even to the point that we don't know what to pray for or how to pray. And in that moment, we have the Holy Spirit himself interceding for us, praying for us. Martin Luther preached a sermon on Pentecost, and he had this to say about this passage in Romans 8. There is, in believers, continual groaning after holiness, groaning too deep for expression, as Paul says in Romans 8:26. But Christians have a blessed listener, the Holy Spirit himself. He readily perceives sincere longing after purity and sends the conscience divine comfort. That divine comfort, sent by the Holy Spirit, is, of course, the peace that surpasses all understanding. It is the Holy Spirit, the Paraclete, giving us hope that the suffering we are experiencing here and now does not have the final word over us, but Jesus Christ does. And that word is forgiven, child of God.